If you want to be a better writer, there are 3 things you need to do. First, understand storytelling principles. Second, see how other writers have applied those principles. And then, thirdly, use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor and poet, and I have a passion for middle grade and young adult stories, spy stories, fairy tales and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
And today we'll be studying genre as it relates to the film Late Night. This 2019 film is from an original screenplay written by Mindy Kaling, and it was directed by Nisha Ganatra. Mindy also stars in the movie along with the brilliant Emma Thompson, and in fact, Mindy wrote the script with Emma in mind. In our discussion, there will be spoilers because we can't possibly discuss the craft of a story without them. So, okay, Valerie, why don't you start by telling us why you chose Late Night for our first episode?
Well, the answer is pretty simple. I chose it because I think Emma Thompson and Mindy Kaling are brilliant and funny, and I really enjoyed the film when I first saw it. But more than that, I thought it actually might open up an interesting conversation with respect to genre. Is it a comedy? Is it a drama? Or is it something else entirely? Okay, now let me back up for a minute to explain why genre is the theme for season 1. In a nutshell, it's because everything in a story flows from the genre choice. The problem, of course, is that in this industry, there's no standard definition of genre. In fact, we don't have a standard vocabulary for any storytelling principle. So to add to the complication, not only do writers disagree on what genre means to us, but we see genre in a very different way than agents see it, or publishers, or readers. Now, I freely admit that up to now, I've looked at genre through the StoryGrid lens, and I still think that Sean Coyne's Genre Clover is a very useful tool. However, I've decided to take Robert McKee's advice to heart. So in his book Story, and this is on page 89, he writes, "You must not only respect, but master your genre and its conventions. Never assume that because you've seen films in your genre that you know it. You must study the form. Books of genre criticism may help, but few are current and none is complete. Read everything nonetheless, for we need all possible help from wherever we can get it. The most valuable insights, however, come from self-discovery." McKee isn't kidding when he says that when it comes to genre, few theory books are current and none is complete. He's really serious when he says that. And I've only read a fraction of the books that he's read, but that has been my experience. It's probably why I gravitated toward Sean's Genre Clover so much. But I do see theorists building on the lessons of those that have come before them. For example, Sean was influenced by Robert McKee with respect to genre and many other concepts, and McKee was in turn influenced by Norman Friedman with respect to genre. So over the course of this season, I'll be digging into the various theory books that I have in my library to see what they all have to say about genre so that I can deepen my understanding of the concept, and hopefully that means that your understanding of genre will deepen too. Now, before I go any further, I want to be clear about what I mean when I say genre. For some people, genre means lowbrow literature or storytelling or commercial fiction. For me, it simply means the kind of story we're dealing with. All right. Everything flows from genre choice. So if that is true, and it is, yet we don't have a common understanding of genre, which we don't, what are we supposed to do? That's not very helpful. The bottom line here is that each of us has got to find a view of genre that works for us, and we got to stick with it. So over the course of the whole season, both Melanie and I will be looking at a whole bunch of different approaches, like I said, with the goal of deepening our understanding, and hopefully one or more of the methods that we touch on will resonate with you.
So, having said that everything in a story flows from genre choice, how did you work out what the main genre of late night is?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is clearly articulate what our story is about. Now, when I say this to clients, they usually tell me that their story is about many things. And so, because of that, they can't possibly boil it down to one thing. Or they tell me that they're blending genres. I'll talk about blending genres in a couple minutes, but let's just put first thing first. Yes, your story might very well have many elements in it, but it's still only about one thing. In fact, it must be about only one thing. Why? Because a story that's about everything is a story that's about nothing. And Lisa Cron goes into this quite a bit with Story Genius and Wired for Story. So I recommend both of those books. She has courses too, if you want to check those out. There's a really practical reason why your story is about one thing and one thing only. And those reasons have to do with both the craft and with the marketing. We'll be discussing craft now over the course of the whole season, obviously. But in terms of marketing, just let me do a quick aside here. Regardless of your publishing model, whether you're going to be an indie author or you want to go the traditional route, you as the writer have got to make the first sale, right? You're either selling your book directly to a reader, or you have to sell it to an agent who in turn sells it to a publisher. The sales pitch focuses on this one idea that your book or your screenplay is about. I mean, you can't avoid that. So, okay, a story makes one point, and if you don't believe me, that is perfectly fine. Don't take my word for it. Don't take my word for anything that we say here, that I say here on the podcast. Really go and do your own research. Analyze films and television shows and novels. And the more you do, the more you'll see that each of those stories, the ones that have lasted the test of time, the ones that are resonating with current audiences, they're about one thing. Now, with respect to late night, we could say that it is about diversity in the workplace. We could say it's about women in male-dominated jobs. We could say that it's about a young woman coming to a big city to pursue her dream, or it's about abuse of authority, or we could simply say it's about a late night talk show. All of those things are true. They're all true because Mindy Kaling is an excellent writer, and she's also a very experienced writer. So she has no problem weaving lots of different ideas together. She's one of these writers who was writing since she was 6 years old. And then she did formal education about how to write. I think she did stage plays. I think her background is similar to Aaron Sorkin's. Yeah, not bad, right? But I think that at its heart, late night is about a woman who has forgotten who she is and what she values. Catherine Newberry has had to fight her way to the top in a very competitive, male-dominated profession. And in doing so, she's lost herself. She even says that she's become like the men in her field. She's also become jaded and cynical and, frankly, mean. And that's the way she is when we meet her at the beginning of the film. But by the end, she's learned the error of her ways, and she's a nice woman again. Now, stop for a moment and think about that. What other stories have that plot line? Well, there are lots. But the granddaddy of them all, believe it or not, is A Christmas Carol. Ebenezer Scrooge is black-hearted at the beginning, but kind and generous at the end. So Catherine, like Ebenezer Scrooge, is redeeming herself over the course of the story. Yes, there are two main characters, Catherine and Molly. But Catherine, in my opinion, is the primary antagonist, so it's her story I'm considering when I'm thinking about the story's genre. Since Catherine has redeemed herself in terms of genre, this is a redemption story.
So I think it's interesting that there are two primary characters in this story. And I agree also that the primary protagonist is Catherine because she changes the most over the course of the movie. Molly learns a few things along the way, but they felt a bit light to me. And perhaps this is because Kaling's approach was to deal with serious things in a way that's lighthearted, or the most serious things are often said in jest sort of spirit. Catherine and Molly are each other's antagonists through the story, along with some other characters, but these two have the most interactions in the movie. And I think this is a problem, and it confused my expectations. So usually I don't think about a movie's genre in a mindful way until after I've seen it. But I'll start watching the trailers and looking at the marketing material, and in some cases I'll see interviews on shows like Graham Norton to decide if a story is for me or not. And before I sat down to analyse Late Night, I watched the trailer and I also read the IMDb description. And both seem to suggest two leading ladies, Catherine fighting for her showbiz survival and Molly a saviour-like figure. So I was expecting a performance story, and I thought Molly's story as a script writer was going to be the lead story. However, after I saw the movie, it was mostly Catherine's story with some of Molly's story thrown in. Molly's story is a bit all over the place. There's the commentary on white privilege, with the no-win scenario being an equity hire in a world that recognises it needs diversity but doesn't like it when it happens. Her moving out of home story, standing on her own 2 feet, and there's a romance story in there a bit. So that's a lot. And while all the topics are important, they are rolled up into a personal growth plot for Molly, and I don't believe that the movie does justice to any of Molly's story. So Catherine's story was a mix of performance and redemption, in my view, and perhaps a better way to describe it is that the performance story provided the framework for the redemption story. So we see the external accolades, such as the Emmys and the Lifetime Achievement Award that Catherine receives at the beginning of the movie, and they are physical representations of her as the personification of comedic excellence. We hear about Catherine's failing ratings, so her ability to entertain her audience is waning, and we see her start a stand-up skit at the cancer charity that does not land, and this is because of her own misguided belief that she stands for excellence. But it's clear to me that Catherine's view of excellence has distorted over time, and she's gone from striving for excellence to she is excellence. So Catherine has put herself above her audience and her guests, and the response to her performances reflects that. So she needs to find her humanity again and remember to serve her audience. And this happens when an affair that she had with Charlie, one of the writers, is made public. Catherine has 2 choices at this point in time. She can leave her show, something a few people have been trying to force her to do, or she can fess up. So she asks for her audience's forgiveness via a performance. And by this I mean her opening monologue at the beginning of her show as a humble Catherine and not a contemptuous Catherine. And during the monologue, she acknowledges that she is there to serve her audience when she says with genuine emphasis, "I hope I have earned the pleasure of your time." And as a quick aside, I'm writing a performance story at the moment, and I've noticed with all the performance stories that I've watched and I've read over the last couple of years that they actually give a writer a really good structure to work within. So most performance stories happen in a framework of practice, training for a performance event or for a competition. And there's usually an element of judgment in some way. It's either whether someone will win or whether their performance is good enough to move to the next level. And I saw this for Catherine. To keep her show, she had to do new things, practice her comedy in new ways, and increase ratings and her likability, which is the judgment part of, I think, that performance framework that she's operating in. And this is why I believe the performance genre gives a framework for Catherine's redemption story. So now it sounds like I didn't like Late Night, but that's not true. I did. I love the witty writing for Catherine and Molly's characters, and I walked away from it feeling good. But when I put on my writer's analytical hat, I saw the movie differently, and this explains probably why my expectations were not met, considering my first impressions to what I then saw when I watched the movie.
I want to touch on something you said there. You said the performance story provided the framework for the redemption story. And yes, I agree totally. When a story is primarily about the shift that takes place within a character, we call those character-driven stories, we need something happening in the outside world to force the character to change. There's always an external reason for an internal change. And that's true in our lives, right? That's true in reality. we don't just decide to lose weight and get in shape. Something in our external world has inspired us to do that. We've gotten negative test results from the doctor, or we have to take medication to control blood pressure or cholesterol or something like that, or our jeans don't fit anymore. How many can relate to that after 2 years of COVID lockdown? So there's something happening in the outside world that forces us to change either our beliefs or our behavior. And that, of course, for lasting change, that requires an internal shift. So, it's interesting what you say here about the performance story, Melanie, because when I first watched it, I thought it might be a global performance. And certainly both Catherine and Molly are having performance stories. For Catherine, it's redemption plus performance. And for Molly, as you pointed out, it's maturation and performance. The main reason that I went with performance as the secondary genre is that there isn't an opponent. Yes, there are definitely antagonists. Caroline, the head of the network, she's a major antagonist. In fact, even though it's a dual protagonist story, the protagonists are antagonistic to each other. Like Molly is driving Catherine forward. Catherine is forcing Molly to be a better writer. It's a beautiful, beautiful interplay between the two. I really appreciated that. Yes, okay, there is Daniel, the other comedian, but he's such a minor character that he's not much of a threat. Catherine is a much stronger character. And so when Molly puts that bug in her ear that, you don't have to, during sweeps week, you don't have to give the show over to him. When we see Catherine setting up to undermine Daniel live on TV, I don't know about you, Melanie, but I didn't have any doubt that she was going to do it. My question was, what's going to happen? He's not going to be happy. There's going to be ramifications for this, but she is going to do it. So if you think about an opponent, they can be a character who is active in the story. Like in the Hunger Games, the opponents are active in the story the whole time. If you think about Rocky, Apollo Creed he's not really in the show a lot. It's sort of his reputation is there. He's not on screen a lot, but his persona, his reputation is certainly driving Rocky forward. And of course, the performance is the whole third act, the whole end of the film. There also isn't a big performance at the end here. Like, Rocky, like I just said, the boxing match is the whole third act. In Black Swan, we see Nina Sayer dance. Even in Billy Elliot, we get to see Billy. The performance is nodded to in that film, but it still works. I love that film. Even in what's the Eddie the Eagle movie? Maybe it's just called Eddie the Eagle. We get to see the big. It is okay. We get to see him, right? And really, I was watching that for Hugh Jackman. I'll be perfectly honest, but I still enjoyed it. So here, there isn't a big performance at the end. Catherine does, and in a performance story, in the big performance at the end, this is when the character's gift is expressed. And you know what, Melanie, as I'm saying this, I think that's a great theme for a whole season, the character's gift being expressed, because that's a really challenging concept to understand, but it's an important one. So for Catherine, what is her gift? It's Molly calls it out, right? When Molly does the joke about Planned Parenthood, and Catherine, it's when they're talking about the beauty contest and the dog contest, and Catherine does a little bit of a rant, and Molly says, "See there, that's authentic to you. That's when you come alive as a performer. So at the stand up at the cancer fundraiser, we see her sort of losing her way because she's kind of talking to herself and thinking out loud, but into a microphone in front of an audience. And then when she realizes that that's what she's doing, you see a shift in her and she becomes a performer and she does a whole spiel on being an older woman in Hollywood and what is she going to do? And the audience loves it. That's her gift being expressed. She can do comedy that no other late night comedian can do because she's a woman. So that's the middle of the movie. It's not at the end of the movie where we would expect to see the big performance where the gift is expressed. Now, Catherine also does a mea culpa at the end, right, in a little stand up. And Melanie, you talked about this already. And I think that is highlighting her internal shift more than her skill as a performer. But yeah, in saying all that, there's definitely a case to be made for this being a global performance story. The two genres are working hand in glove. And, that's the beauty of Kaling's writing. That's the mastery of the craft that Kaling has. So off the top, I said that I chose late night because I thought it would open up an interesting conversation about genre, because even though now I've just said I think it's a redemption story with a performance secondary, it's being marketed as a comedy or a drama or like a witty drama. So like, what do we do with that? If we're writers in our writing room and we're looking for masterworks for our work in progress, and we start to do Google searches, what do we do if they're marketed as witty dramas? That doesn't really help us, right? Okay, there are outright jokes in it. Yes, there are obviously comedy writers, and those are funny, like the Ask a Chemist, she'll have the solution joke made me laugh. But for my money, it's the dialogue here that is really beautiful. Catherine has those one-liners and Molly has all her quips. Like she says, "Oh, I saw most of the writers. I'm not overly worried about masculinity." So, so if we're saying that late night is some combination of redemption and performance, why is it listed as a comedy drama or a witty drama? How can we square this? Well, there's a couple of things happening here. Comedy and drama are marketing genres. They're not writing genres, but they're also referring to the style that the story is being told in. It's not a reference to the plot. Redemption and performance are about the plot. And so in a lot of theory books, they don't talk specifically about genre, but you might see a lot of references to plot. And that may or may not, the author may or may not be talking about genre. You kind of have to read the book to find out. Also, comedy and drama, it's on brand for both Mindy Kaling and Emma Thompson. So when we hear, as an audience member, we hear those names, especially together, we're expecting a story that's both smart and funny. And I think Late Night delivers on that. Kaling is tackling some serious issues in this movie, but it's not done in a preachy way. There's a comedic edge. Those issues are not the point of the movie. They are part of the environment that the movie is set in. So while comedy and drama tell the audience what to expect in terms of the story's overall tone, it doesn't tell the audience what the story is about. So as you're reading theory reference books, read the plot section, because there's often a plot section. And, they talk about different types of plots and whatnot. And use the information that they're finding there against the films that you're watching, against the books that you're reading, and see if it's helping you understand the type of story that's being told, or if they're talking about something more general like the hero's journey structure, because a lot of them talk about that too, although they don't necessarily reference Campbell. Melanie?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree that comedy drama does make sense for late night, because there are absolutely both elements of that in the story. And if I'm honest, at the end of a long week or when I'm going to the movies with my family, I look at descriptors like comedy or romance, and I make a choice depending on how I want to feel. So if I've been fighting with the kids, then it's more likely that I'll look at something that's not too dramatic. I'll either choose something that will give me a good belly laugh or release the tension in the room, or after the long day or the hard day the kids have had. Or I might need a shot of adrenaline to pump me up for a busy weekend. So I'll watch an action movie or a thriller just to help get me going and to help motivate me a little bit more. So I think this ties in with the expectations that people have when they're choosing a story or a movie. And I'll use story in a very generic way. So I'll use it for movies or books or series. If you're interested in binge watching, things like Netflix series, because when we use those labels, it's to help us look at how we want to feel. So as writers, we need to be mindful of this. So if a story is marketed as a comedy, obviously it has to make people laugh, but it also has to work as a story and not just as a string of good jokes. And the same with thrillers, whether they are set in Edwardian times or in the year 2092, they need to take us to the edge in a way that's different from watching a series of extreme games competitions. So streaming services like Netflix may present a story as a comedy, but the other marketing material might tell us more about what to expect of the story that we're going to choose. As Valerie mentioned before, there aren't a great deal of writing craft books about genres. Susan Keen's book Narrative Form discusses genre as a subset of narrative fiction from an academic perspective, but she makes some great points about genre. And the one I think that applies to what I'm trying to say here is that genre provides us boundaries and sets expectations. Alexandra Sokoloff takes the concept of what kind of story is it a bit further in her book Screenwriting Tricks for Authors in Chapter 4. So she lists story types and then provides titles of movies as examples of that type of story. So if you're starting out and you want to understand story types in an easily digestible way, then this is a really good chapter to read. So Late Night is a comedy drama and not a comedy western or any other blend of those types of descriptors. So we as consumers of stories can choose a movie or a book or a series based on whether we want to laugh, cry, or be scared. But the genre presented when stories are marketed are not the only expectations. Or as Valerie said, there are conventions writers need to consider when we're writing. So I think we both agree that Late Night is a comedy drama, and we also agree that it is a redemption plot framed by the conventions of a performance story. And I think even though we got there probably by slightly different means. So I think it's also safe to say that we both laughed during the movie, and we were both also enthralled by the serious and the more serious scenes as well.
When I first watched Late Night, I enjoyed it. And then I watched it a second time with my daughter, and it was really fun to see where she laughed um, and what her reaction to it was. And this is one of those movies I keep going back to and watching over and over because I still find it funny, even though now I know when the joke is coming. I'm laughing in advance because the joke is still funny. This is one of my favorites, and it's by two of my favorite performers, Emma Thompson and Mindy Kaling. All right. So in the beginning, I said I was going to talk about genre blending. And I have to do a mea culpa here. All right. A little while ago, I gave a presentation to a group of writers. And during the presentation, I fell into the very trap that I was warning them to avoid. I said that because there's no common language in this business, that when we're learning story theory, we need to focus on the concept that's being discussed, not the label or the term that's being used to describe the concept. Because if we're focusing on the term, it's no end of confusion and headache and frustration. Then an author told me she was blending genres, and I kind of lost my mind. Blending genres is because I focused on what blending genres means to me rather than what the author is actually doing in her work. Anyway, blending genres it's a pretty common strategy for novice writers. It really is. It's also common to have, way too many characters, too many plot lines, too many timelines. That's a conversation for another day. In other words, it's really common for novice writers not to know the one thing that their story is about, right? So because of that, because I've dealt with a lot of writers now at this point in my career, and I hope to deal with many more, I hope to have the privilege of their time in the future. But because of my experience so far, when novice writers tell me that they're blending genres, it tends to be a flag telling me that they don't understand the importance of genre. They think that they're being innovative and they're coming from a good place. They want to create the best novel that they can possibly create. And I applaud that. High five. However, please believe me when I say that we cannot possibly innovate something that we have not yet first mastered. And when I was doing my research for this episode, I came upon a quote from Robert McKee, and he said this: "To anticipate the anticipations of the audience, you must master your genre and its conventions." So, to me, blending genres means that someone is writing a Franken story, right? They're sticking bits of other genres together because they don't yet know the one thing that their story is about. And they're doing it in the hope of creating a really compelling story. And I get that. I totally get it. But what they're really doing is writing a confusing story. Now, that said, a story can have many genres working within it. Late Night has performance, redemption, and maturation all working together. There's even a hint, as Melanie said, of a love story for Molly, although it isn't really developed. And a little side note here, I think that whole love story for Molly is in the book to help us have more compassion for Catherine when we find out that she also had an affair with Charlie. Charlie is not the nice guy he seems to be. So she was duped. I'm not letting her off the hook, okay? However, she is a pretty mean and nasty character at the beginning. And because of that, the audience needs to have empathy for her somewhere along the line. And this is the revelation of her affair with Charlie comes at a crucial time in the story. And the audience needs to have empathy for Catherine at this point. So knowing that Charlie is the kind of guy he is and that Catherine was going through a difficult period and kind of got duped and immediately regretted it and certainly hasn't repeated it, it helps build some empathy for Catherine. Although, like I said, I'm not letting her off the hook. So even though Late Night has a number of genres working within it, they're not blending. Like if Melanie and I sat down with our red pens and our real editor hats, we could clearly trace these genres. We can clearly see Catherine's redemption. We can clearly see Molly's maturation. We can clearly see a performance story, and we could articulate Molly's love story. That's not genre blending. That's understanding how each of these genres work and how to make them work together without blending them. They're complementing one another. It's not a mishmash. So let me give you another example. Black Swan, okay? It's a global performance story with thriller elements, a psychological thriller to be exact, but it's not a blend of thriller and performance. It is a very clear performance story that has a sort of a dark filter over it, that psychological thriller lens on it. So one other thing I want to say here, just as I finish off, and we don't really have time to dig into it here, but maybe it's a great topic for another episode. I do want to flag it for you right now, though, because I see this confusion popping up a lot. There is a difference between a story being a thriller and a story being thrilling. There's also a difference between writing a suspense story and writing a story that's suspenseful. So unless you've got a really clear handle on genre, you're going to get confused about this. You're going to get confused about what it is you're trying to write. Genre is a foundational concept. So when I'm working with clients, the very first thing we talk about is what genre will their story be, because everything else that we do will depend on what the global genre for their work in progress is.
So I think that's a really good point, Valerie. And I suppose you and I will, disagree on some of those smaller genres that are in there. Particularly, I think some of the ones that were given to Molly were she was given too many, in my view, to deal with in the movie of Late Night. And I thought a good example of that was the romance plot. To me, that wasn't very convincing in the movie, and because Molly makes a big deal at the beginning of the movie that she doesn't have a boyfriend, and because of this, she can dedicate all her time to a job, and it implies that she's a loser in life, and so the romance subplot in this movie doesn't seem to gel quite with that view that she has presented herself with as at the beginning. And the romance with Charlie, who's one of the other writers that Molly works with, and he's one of the first ones that's actually nice to her. When he asks her out to see his stand-up routine and they end up kissing, that seems to be okay. But I actually don't think that needed to happen to create the empathy for Catherine. I think they could have set up Charlie as a cad without necessarily him having some sort of emotional or romantic tangle with Molly. And it's because it's revealed a very short time afterwards that Charlie is a bit of a player when it's revealed that he had a one-night stand with Catherine. And, that is the setup, for Catherine's fall from grace, as you mentioned. But there were also other aspects in Charlie's role in the movie that I thought were incomplete and were not filled out as well as they could be. So they weren't paid off, I suppose, in my view. So I don't understand fully how Charlie's and Catherine's emails were leaked. That was never explained, although it was implied that it was done deliberately to assist Catherine's fall from grace for payback of not handing over her show. And when after Molly works out that Charlie's a player and she refuses to speak to him, this paves the way for a friendship with Tom to start. And then it's alluded to at the end of the movie that Molly and Tom are seeing each other. So the romance aspects, I think, of the movie are meant to be part of Molly's maturation, but it's very light, and I think it's very unconvincing in the movie. And like I mentioned before, I think the movie still could have worked and been successful if it was not there. And I think it detracted from some of the more serious topics raised by Molly's character in the movie, such as discrimination and diversity. And I definitely don't think that being in a romantic relationship is a contributor to overall life happiness. So that didn't seem to ring true for me either, for Molly. And if the romance part of Molly's arc was linked to self-confidence and self-respect, then I don't think that was conveyed well in the movie at all. And there were other subplots in Molly's story that I think received a bit of a light dusting, but the romance one for me was the most obvious example of perhaps trying to do too much. So I think Molly's arc could have been better served if it was focused on her journey to being an essential member of the writing team, as well as how she transformed Catherine's character from being a woman who hates women to a more compassionate and authentic person. And I'm a big believer in the KISS principle, like keep it simple. And I would think add layers and complexity if you have your one genre down pat. And just like you said, I think get that main story down and get those conventions working really well first before you start adding multiple other things on top of that.
So we want to end each episode with an action item for you all. At the beginning of the episode, we talked about the 3 steps to improving your craft, right? Understand the storytelling principle, see how other writers have applied it to their work, and then use it in your own work. Here on this podcast, we're filling in the first 2. We're addressing the first 2 steps. But we want to leave you with an action item so that you can get started on the 3rd. Okay, so here's this week's action item. Identify the one global genre for your story. Remember that a story makes one point. If your story is about everything, then it's about nothing. It might take you a while to discover the one thing that you're telling your story about, but this is time well spent. It's a very important, it's crucial actually that you know this. If you don't know the one point your story is making, you may not be able to identify your genre, and you may not be able to write a story that works.
So that wraps it up for this week. Join us again for next week when we're going to discuss the Oscar-winning West Side Story. And to support this show, please leave us a rating and a review and tell your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/innercircle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. And if you'd like to find more out about me, visit melaniehill.com.au or visit me on Facebook, Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.